as this week's question is, how do we interpret and apply the Bible properly?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and we could spend a ton of time answering it, but I want to try to answer it as quickly and as succinctly as we can. There's a little bit of a difference between how you're going to approach the Old Testament from the New Testament. So whenever you're reading the Old Testament, really what you're wanting to do when you approach it is you're wanting to approach it on its own terms, but you're also wanting to find Christ at the center of all of it, right? Because all of Scripture is this one story of how God has sent His eternal Son to redeem all of mankind. So that's the big story of the Bible. And so Jesus is present in the Old Testament, and so we just have to find Him. So, for example, one of those stories is David versus Goliath, right? Here's what we typically do with that story. A lot of times we read it wrongly, we read ourselves into it when we actually miss the entire point of it. So
you mean Goliath's not our problem?
Right.
We're not David?
Right, that's exactly right. Goliath is not a symbol of our life's problems, and we're not David. That's not approaching the text in its historical context. So David and Goliath is what David and Goliath is. It is David going to war against Goliath, him defeating Goliath, but there's a deeper aspect to that, and here's how. David is typologically pointing forward to Jesus, who would become and who would be the greater David, who would defeat the enemy. So here's a detail in that passage that really connects that. It says that Goliath is wearing a coat of scales in the passage. That's a detail we typically miss. So why is it saying this in this passage? Well, think about it. Think about the symbolism there. What else do we know in Scripture that has scales? The serpent, the dragon, right? So there's that Christocentric type of typology there. And so it's really a picture of how the greater David would come and slay our enemy, the serpent and the dragon. So whenever you're in the Old Testament, you're wanting to really find Christ at the center of the story. You're not wanting to read yourself into the story, because that's how the apostles and that's how Jesus read the Old Testament. They look at it trying to find Jesus there. So whenever you come to the New Testament, you're wanting to see how Jesus kind of fulfilled all of these things, right? You see a ton of that. But so you're also wanting to. Here's what I would tell you: if you're reading the New Testament, you want to approach it as though you were the person receiving the letter, right? If you're reading the book of Romans, you should approach that book as a Roman Christian living in the first century who is receiving that letter. That's how you want to think about that letter. Because if you don't, what you'll do is you'll read things from your modern day back into the text rather than drawing things out of the text. Now, what those are called is exegesis and eisegesis. Now, I know that sounds complicated, and I know that sounds intimidating, but exegesis essentially is reading out of the text what is in the text.
Right.
Eisegesis is reading back into the text something that's not into the text. So we want to avoid that. So we want to apply the Bible in this way. We want to come to the passage. We want to see what's there. We want to exegete it, draw out the doctrine in the passage, and we want to find timeless principles that are in the passage that apply to all people at all time. So back to the David versus Goliath story, just real quick for an example. So we're not David, right? Our life's problems aren't Goliath. So how does this passage apply to us today, right? Because it's not written to us, it's written for us. So how does this apply? Well, it applies in this way. Jesus has come, He has slain our enemy. There are tons of life application to that, right? Like that has tons of implications. And if we're in Jesus, then we have also overcome the enemy as well by way of union with Christ. So that's kind of how I would answer those questions. I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
I love how you mentioned, like for example, the letter was written to Rome.
Right.
To read it as a letter. And we have to remember that verses wasn't in the Bible at that time also.
Right.
So we need to read it as a whole.
Yeah.
So we can't just take one verse and create our whole theology off of that one verse, but we have to interpret Scripture with Scripture. So if you come to one verse, you come up with your whole theology, and then another verse contradicts that, well, it's not that the Bible contradicts itself, it's that your theology is wrong. So that's how we have to read it as a whole.
I think that's really, really good. So I don't know if I have anything else that I would add.
Yeah, guys, I think that was really good. Thank you for that. And remember, if you have any more questions, just get them to us, and we'll try to get to them on another video.